Welcome to Lecture 19 in this course on Christianity and the Enlightenment. Today we come to three different individuals, and we will start with Adam Smith, and he will take up most of our time. In this lecture and then the last lecture, lecture number 20, I hope to highlight divergent legacies coming out of the Enlightenment, out of the end of the 18th century, trying to wrap up some major themes, even as we still look at these individuals, but trying to spin out into what the Enlightenment's impact has been on our world and on all of us. And we are going to look at three different figures in this lecture who represent two different ways of looking at the world. The title of this lecture, A Conflict of Visions, comes from a book by the same name by the Stanford economist Thomas Sowell. Sowell is an African-American conservative, but in that particular book, he's not really trying to take sides as much as he is trying to lay out the intellectual roots of many of our present-day political differences, and he calls it a conflict of visions. He defines vision as a pre-analytic cognitive act. So he's using the term not as a dream or a hope, but more as a sense of causation. Why are things the way they are? How does the world work? And he says, on the one hand, he calls it a constrained vision. And in the constrained vision, human nature is seen as fixed, inherently self-interested. In this constrained vision, so-called because the human person is constrained and our vision of things is constrained, we have to deal with people as they are, not as we want them to be. And so we must deal in the realm of moral philosophy with trade-offs, and we often have to settle for what is better, even though it's clearly not perfection. On the other hand, he labels the other set of vision principles an unconstrained vision, which sees human nature as malleable. And with the right education, the right use of reason, people are basically good, trustworthy. So there's a difference in the fundamental questions one asks in a constrained vision or unconstrained vision. The constrained vision asks, what are the unique circumstances and special causes that produce peace and prosperity? So the assumption is this is not going to be the default, but what are the institutions, what are the ideas that have produced peace and prosperity? In the unconstrained vision, it's the opposite assumption. What are the special causes and circumstances of war, poverty, and crime? So they look at those negative things in society, and of course this is a generalization, but whereas the constrained vision might say, well, that's what's to be expected with people. And the brilliance of particular institutions or structures is to ameliorate those causes that are endemic in the human spirit. Whereas in the unconstrained vision, it says war, poverty, scarcity, oppression, this must be the effect of some nefarious other or system. And of course, you can see these are generalizations. You wouldn't want to ultimately, absolutely pit one against the other, but it's a general impulse and the sort of questions that they ask. Sowell's book examines the ideologies behind these visions and how they shape how people view equality, power, justice, the three things that we're still arguing about. And a quick look at the index in his book shows that the two Enlightenment thinkers he most associates with the constrained vision are Adam Smith and Edmund Burke, who have very important differences between them as well, but he puts them as examples of the constrained vision, while the two he most associates in the Enlightenment with the unconstrained vision are William Godwin and the Marquis de Condorcet, which are the two we'll look at here in this lecture, and we'll save Edmund Burke for the last lecture. So, Adam Smith. He was born in 1723 in a Scottish city that looks like Kirkcaldy, but I believe it's pronounced Kirkcaldy, a small town on the Firth of Forth. That's not a mispronunciation, look it up. The Firth of Forth in the east coast of Scotland. After attending school in Kirkcaldy, he matriculated to the University of Glasgow in 1737. And there, importantly, he was influenced by the one he called the never-to-be-forgotten Francis Hutcheson. In 1740, Smith left Glasgow for Balliol College, one of the colleges at Oxford, where he stayed for 6 years. Interestingly enough, he has this quote about Oxford. Sorry for any Oxford grads in our class or watching this, but he says, I was there for 6 years and I wondered if they ever had any interest in actually teaching us. So just hopefully that's not the case. Still, in 1748, or rather in 1746, he returns home to Scotland and he doesn't really have a plan for what comes next. He was not born into nobility or into an elite class, as many of these Enlightenment thinkers were. By 1748, however, he had been invited to give a series of public lectures in Edinburgh, lectures that were supported in part by Lord Kaimes. You needed often to have some sort of patron to help pay for your way. And so he gave a series of public lectures, not just once, but recurring. And he made a name for himself and was elected to the chair of logic at Glasgow University in 1751, and then in the next year, the chair of moral philosophy. He was there for over a decade when a wealthy English politician sought out Smith to tutor his son. Now, strange for us to think, you would think, you're the chair at the University of Glasgow. It's a big career downgrade, isn't it, to be a private tutor for some elite person's son? But the position as a tutor brought a much better salary, a handsome salary, and the promise that this would be a pension for the rest of his life. And so he resigned his position at Glasgow, and he became this boy's tutor in 1764. He went with his family. They went to France, where Smith met Voltaire, where he was welcomed into the salons of Paris, where he met leading philosophers like D'Alembert, D'Holbach, Helvetius. After 2 years in France and a few months in London, he returned to Scotland. In 1778, Smith was appointed Commissioner of Customs and Excise in Edinburgh, where he spent the last 12 years of his life. Interestingly, Smith never married, and when back in Scotland, he lived with his mother, Margaret, and Adam Smith finally died in 1790. During the 1770s, Smith was a proponent for independence for the American colonies. He was not a passionate supporter of the American cause per se, like John Witherspoon would be when he moved to the colonies, but he was a realist, and he thought too many mistakes had been made already to hold on to the colonies, and that managing them across an ocean was not practical. In 1776, Smith predicted that Britain would lose the 13 colonies and end up defending Canada, which he considered the worst possible outcome. No offense to the Canadians, but he wasn't anything against Canada. He just thought, we're going to lose America, we're going to keep Canada, and that was the worst, he thought, because that was the most expensive way to do it. Go to war with America and lose, and then have to keep Canada and pay for it. He also predicted, rather presciently, that without a union to Great Britain, the inhabitants of Ireland would not remain one people. Proved to be true. He also surmised that America might overtake Britain in economic production in little more than a century. I have to go and look at the GDP numbers to see when that happened, but not bad predictions. Smith was not a religious man, though like most men of his age, he spoke of a creator God, of an afterlife, even spoke of being made in God's image. He was very close friends with David Hume. More religious than Hume, but it's hard to be less religious than Hume, but he may not have been a whole lot more religious than Hume. After Hume died in 1776, Smith published a letter extolling Hume's courage and fortitude during his last days. Now you have to remember, people in Scotland all knew of Hume, and for most people he was, he may have been brilliant, but he was an infidel, and he spurned his baptism and his church, and so people were hoping and praying that he would have a deathbed conversion. And so when Smith publishes this account of his life in a letter and saying he had such fortitude and courage facing death, but of course never converted to Christ or anything like that, Smith's letter was not very well received. The letter, Smith later wrote in 1780, quote, brought me 10 times more abuse than the very violent attack I had made upon the whole commercial system of Great Britain. So he says, I wrote Wealth of Nations to attack the whole commercial system of Great Britain, and I didn't get as much opposition as I did for my letter, which was extolling the virtues of David Hume. Smith published 2 important and rather dissimilar works. He published more than that, but his 2 most significant. One is a theory of moral sentiments in 1759, and then the other, more well-known to most people, give the short title, Wealth of Nations in 1776. So you see what a consequential year 1776 was. It's the year Hume died. It's the year Wealth of Nations comes out. Of course, the year that America declares independence. These 2 works have often baffled scholars because they seem to be so different and in some ways apparently divergent. One recent scholarly article says, there is still no widely agreed version of what it is that links these 2 texts aside from their common author. In Enlightenment historiography, there is something called Das Adam Smith problem. It's called that because it originated in the German reception of Adam Smith's ideas, and so it's called Das Adam Smith problem, which says, how do we reconcile these 2 works, and in particular, the seemingly different idea of human nature in these 2 works? To put it very simply, human nature is built upon sympathy in the theory of moral sentiments, and seems to be built upon self-interest in the Wealth of Nations. And so scholars have said, well, he seems to have a rosier view of human nature here and a less sanguine view of human nature here. How do we make sense of Smith's moral and ethical concerns in these 2 books? At least part of the solution is to realize that Smith did not use the word sympathy or the word self-interest in exactly the same way that we might use them. Remember, Smith was taught by Francis Hutcheson, was a great influence on him. And he does adopt some of Hutcheson's views of sentiment and benevolence. But the animating principle for Smith is sympathy. But it's important to know what that means. He doesn't mean pity. We use sympathy. Oh, I have a lot of sympathy for you, which basically means I feel sorry for you. Or maybe we think when you're sympathetic, you sort of feel what they feel. Sympathy for Smith is not a sentiment, but rather the means by which we become aware of all sentiments. So we do not feel sympathy for someone else, but rather we experience all kinds of passions by means of sympathy. Sympathy allows us not to say, I feel what you feel, but to put ourselves in their shoes, imagining what we might feel like if we were in their situation. And so that animates and fires up all the other passions and sentiments. Sympathy tunes the passions and directs sentiment towards social cohesion and useful ends. Now, that may sound like a very rosy view of human nature, but Smith was well aware of our potential for self-deception. His ethic actually calls for, more than anything else, self-command. By sympathy, we can see ourselves as others see us through an impartial, quote, moral looking glass. So this was part of sympathy. It not only allows us to put ourselves in their shoes, but to imagine that how might they also be viewing us? And so it provides a kind of moral looking glass. And this enables us to exercise mastery over the passions and grow in virtues. So natural sympathy, in Smith's thinking, does not mean we all just love each other by default. We have to understand what he means by the term. And similarly, we need to understand what he means by self-interest. Smith rejected the extremely pessimistic views of Hobbes and Mandeville. This has been a big theme throughout this class. Is your view of human nature basically one of they're bent toward benevolence or they're bent toward selfishness? Well, those are two general ways of describing it, but within those general themes, there are a lot of variations. So just take the self-centered view of the human person. There's a reformed anthropology, which understands who we are in the image of God and has a doctrine of a fall and common grace and sin and righteousness and regeneration. Well, someone like Mandeville or Hobbes, they have a very dim view of human nature, but it's not the same as saying it's Augustinian or reformed anthropology. There may be some overlaps, but it's not from the same source. And they tend to be very negative. And so you remember Fable of the Bees, public virtue, private vices, that all the things that we do, whether it's a soldier or a doctor or a pastor, that seem to be really self-abnegating, seem to be altruistic, Mandeville said, that's just a vice. You're really just after your own glory. That's one sort of egoist view of the human person. Smith rejected that. So by self-interest, he don't import to that sinful. Now that may be at times, but that's not the discussion that Smith is having. He does not equate self-interest with vanity and pride. Those were human problems for sure, but Smith uses self-interest in The Wealth of Nations in a more neutral way. He says, we're all motivated by what matters to us. And so if church is the most important thing to you, Smith would say that's your self-interest, and you sacrifice so that you can give your money to the church, give your time to the church. It doesn't mean selfish, it doesn't mean sinful. If your family is most important, then the reason that you go to work and the reason that you save and the reason that you work on the improvement of your land is because of your family. And if fashion is what's important, so self-interest can be either toward good ends or bad ends. The term itself doesn't have to be negative. Smith's point is we are naturally self-interested. That is, we are going to pursue the ends that matter to us. Some will be noble, some will be despicable. This is important, and we're going to come more fully to the Wealth of Nations here, because often in talking about Wealth of Nations or capitalism in general, people will bring up, they bring up the line from Gordon Gekko in Oliver Stone's movie Wall Street. Greed is good. That was the driving engine in capitalism and in Adam Smith's worldview. But that's positively not a statement that Adam Smith would have agreed with. And it may be, some people use it to justify capitalism today, but that's not what Smith means by self-interest. He does not excuse rapacious ends justify the means commerce. Rather, he means to point out that individuals pursuing what they consider good for themselves can produce good for the community at large. individuals pursuing what they deem to be good for themselves, whether that's because they're vain people or they want to give a better life to their children, can actually produce good for the community at large. Let's dive into this. William Godwin, we'll come to him shortly, argued that human actions can be, let's erase this. You can think of human actions like this, and Soul has a simple chart to this effect in his book. Human actions can be either beneficial or harmful, and they can be intentional or unintentional. You know what word I'm trying to say there. I guess I'll try to spell it. Unintentional. So when an action is intentional and it's beneficial, we can call that virtue. When your action is harmful and intentional, you intend to harm somebody, well, that's vice. When you unintentionally harm someone, you didn't mean to, but you still harm someone, you call that negligence, and that's a bad thing. Now, this box is key. And Soul argues that for someone like Godwin, this was an empty set. Unintentional and beneficial doesn't happen. For something to be truly beneficial, there must be an intention behind it. Now, Smith, and again, he's thinking pragmatically more than he is making a theological statement about what makes an action truly good. Smith says, yes, there are all sorts of actions that unintentionally prove to be beneficial to other people. And this is really the heart of Smith's insight. He argues that any time we barter or any time we freely exchange goods and services for money, we are saying, give me what I want, and you shall have this which you want. That's a quote from Smith. So free economic transactions, Smith says, can be win-win. Now, you are guided by self-interest. You want a chicken sandwich at Popeyes, and they want the money. And it's a free exchange. Nobody's forcing you to do it. No one told them what price. They think this is the price where it makes sense for them, and so you give whatever it is for your sandwich there at Popeyes or Chick-fil-A, just trying to say both. And it's a win-win. In both cases, you're pursuing self-interest. They want your money, you want their chicken sandwich. You do not go in thinking, I really want to be beneficial. You most often think, I just want to eat something. And they think, I want to get money. And yet, as you both pursue self-interest, both are pleased with the transaction. You're happy that you have a chicken sandwich. They're happy that someone came to their store and purchased something. So here's Smith's famous way of putting it. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves to their humanity, not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. Famous line from the beginning of The Wealth of Nations. So one of Smith's key insights is that economics is not a zero-sum game. And even though the butcher and the brewer and the baker are pursuing their own ends, and you as a consumer are pursuing your own ends, it ends up being beneficial to both. Prior to capitalism, which is the understanding that Smith is advocating for, though he didn't lay out, I'm writing a pro-capitalist track. But before capitalism, Europe had centuries of mercantilism. It's always important to remember what comes before something, especially in comparing and assessing, was this a good thing or a bad thing? We have to say, well, compared to what? Because these choices are never in a vacuum. Mercantilism, Smith defines as, quote, that system or theory which placed the opulence of a nation on its coin and money. In mercantilism, the seller wins and the buyer loses. That's why Smith says nations wanted to have money, or they wanted to have coin or gold, or however they counted their currency, because it was thought when you sell things, you win. When you buy things, you lose. So businesses wanted monopolies and wanted the government to protect their trade, keep others out, levy restrictions on production. Nations wanted a positive balance of trade. So this is the era of lots of protective tariffs. They thought, if we have more exports going out than imports going in, then that must mean that we're winning the economy. Well, that's a theory of mercantilism. It led to some of the worst characteristics of imperialism. Nations that said, well, we're going to go explore some other place, and we're going to take their resources, we're going to take their gold, we're going to search for the famous El Dorado, city of gold, because that's how we really increase wealth. The assumption is economics is a zero-sum game. You have a pie, and there are 8 pieces, and if you have 5 pieces, there's only 3 left for everyone else. And Smith's revolution, he's certainly not the only one saying these things, is to say, no, wealth can be created. One of the first to argue against this dominant economic practice of mercantilism was a group of French theorists, actually, called the physiocrats. I'd like to see Disney they made Aristocrats, cats. I'd like to see a movie on the physiocrats. The physiocrats, Smith met them when he was in France. They believed that wealth was a matter of land ownership and agricultural development. They believed that government policy should not interfere with natural economics. Physiocracy comes from the Greek words for government or rule and nature. So this is rule by nature. And these physiocrats were actually not Adam Smith. They were the first ones to use the famous phrase, laissez-faire, hands off, or let do is what it literally means. And it was not just freedom from government intrusion, but in Smith's context, freedom from individual collusion. So he actually has more things to say about guilds and how people would come together. And so you're all the blacksmiths, and you come together in some sort of guild, which means to restrict the means of production and keep others out of your field so that your prices can be artificially high. That's the sort of thing he argued against. The ideal, Smith says, quote, every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest in his own way and to bring both his industry and capital into competition with those of any other man or order of men. Smith argues no man has the knowledge necessary to direct all parts of the economy. The miracle of the market is that individuals, all driven by their self-interest, are directed toward the common good, and here's that famous phrase, as if by an invisible hand. Quote, every individual neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. In other words, individuals pursuing their self-interest, their security, applying their industry, their capital, and remember, capital means head, literally. So applying not only their resource capital, but their ingenuity capital. As they do this, pursuing their self-interest, yet it contributes to the common good. So what is the duty of the sovereign in Adam Smith's moral philosophy? He says, quote, according to the system of natural liberty, the sovereign has only three duties to attend to, three duties of great importance. First, the duty of protecting the society from the violence and invasion of other independent societies. Secondly, the duty of protecting as far as possible every member of the society from injustice or oppression of every other member of it. And thirdly, the duty of erecting and maintaining certain public works and certain public institutions. So Smith says those are the three things that the sovereign should do. So the duties of the sovereign: 1, protection from foreign enemies. So he needs to ensure that people aren't coming in and taking your life and liberty. 2, protection from, you might say, internal injustice, crime. See that rights are enforced. And then 3, interestingly, he has a category for public works, by which he means what we might call infrastructure and other things that he thinks can't be left to the private sector, and institutions like education. Famously, one of the quotes I didn't give you is where Adam Smith talks about how pen making develops and how in specialization, and he's really, more than a century ahead of what Henry Ford's going to do with specialization and the assembly line. But part of the problem that Smith sees is specialization is going to lead to economic output and vitality. But the downside is there's a sort of soul shriveling aspect to specialization, that instead of having the creativity to make a product from start to finish and say, here's my wagon that I built for you, no, you're a person in the line of specialization who, hammers the spoke into the wheel in the last stage. So Smith argues that the government ought to provide education so that people can develop and they can learn to do new things and new trades, and that will help mitigate some of what he anticipates to be some of the downsides of this new system. Now, important to remember that in 18th century Scotland, church and state are really fused together in education. It's through parish schools and through governmental support of the established church. So on the one hand, you can say, well, Adam Smith would be a great champion of what we call public schools in America. Well, maybe, or a great champion of public Christian schools. So it's just, we can't always import their ideas and immediately appropriate them in ours, though the principles are worth wrestling with. In summary, though we should not think Smith had a Calvinist anthropology per se, it was still an appraisal of human nature as it appears to be, a kind of constrained vision that people are going to be self-interested. But as they pursue that self-interest, there is a greater good that can be achieved, and indeed the wealth of nations. Let's quickly then look at these other two individuals in this lecture. And we'll start, and I hope I'm saying his name correctly, Condorcet, the Marquis de Condorcet. Condorcet, 1743 to which year? 1794. Here's his full name, Jean-Antoine Nicolas Cariat, later the Marquis de Condorcet. So you can tell by that long name, he was a nobleman, born in 1743 to an ancient French family of military nobility, educated by Jesuits, then the University of Paris, and he decided to leave behind his family's military tradition and pursue mathematics instead. He caught the eye of D'Alembert, one of the philosophes. We didn't do a separate lecture on him, but he's been in the story of many of these men, who secured Condorcet a position at the Paris Academy of Sciences in 1769. D'Alembert also introduced him to the salons of Paris and the philosophes. He met Voltaire. In 1774, the Marquis published Letters of a Theologian to the author of the Dictionary of 3 Centuries, which was a bitter anti-clerical piece. Voltaire and other philosophes applauded it. Condorcet was a proponent of republican ideas. Again, not political parties in America, but ancient Rome, republics. He was against the absolute reign of the French monarchs. He encouraged the laissez-faire principles of the physiocrats in economics. He argued for an expanded definition of the rights of man, including Jews, women, non-whites. So it's important to remember, because we're going to come to some elements of his thinking that probably most people in this class will disagree with, but it's important to remember that sometimes the people in the Enlightenment who had, on the one hand, some of the worst ideas from our vantage point, also were so far ahead of their time that they had some good ideas. And so he was ahead of his time in wanting to extend rights to many others that we would consider to be essential for everyone today. He was the principal author of a Republican Constitution, which he proposed to the convention, not America, but France, in 1793. His supporters, however, were purged from that convention as popular insurrections took hold of the French Revolution. In the summer of 1793, his arrest was ordered by the convention. He fled to the Luxembourg Gardens, which is in Paris. And as the reign of terror grew more violent, he fled to the outskirts of Paris. He was finally arrested on March 27, 1794, and he was found dead in his cell 2 days later. He left behind a political manifesto entitled Sketch for a Historical Picture of the Progress of the Human Mind. We'll just call it his sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human mind, published after he died in 1795. This is what he left behind in his prison cell. Some people have called it the last will and testament of the Enlightenment. Amazingly enough, for someone who died due to a political revolution, Condorcet's manifesto is a paean. Not a European, but a paean, P-A-E-A-N, to the belief in perpetual progress. He believed that enlightened laws and universal education were going to usher in a new era of benevolence and compassion and freedom. Here's a quote. Our hopes for the future condition of the human race can be subsumed under 3 important heads: the abolition of inequality between nations, the progress of equality within each nation, and true perfection of mankind, end quote. In England, the classic Enlightenment perfectionism came from, we're not going to have time to talk about him, but from Joseph Priestley. Priestley was a dissenting pastor, that is non-Anglican. He was an educator, a scientist, a theologian, and he tried to tie Enlightenment rationalism to Christian theism. He believed in the perfectibility of man. He believed society was going to be transformed into a millennial age of peace and prosperity. Priestley abhorred dogma, and not surprisingly, he helped establish Unitarianism in England. He was one of the most radical voices. But back to Condorcet, who is the expression of this perfectibility in France. Let me read this paragraph. Are we not, now remember, he's writing this from or he's been working on it, but he leaves it in his prison cell and he dies. Are we not arrived at the point where there is no longer anything to fear? either from new errors or the return of old ones. When no corrupt institution can be introduced by hypocrisy and adopted by ignorance or enthusiasm, when no vicious combination can affect the infelicity of a great people. Everything tells us that we are approaching the era of one of the grand revolutions of the human race. What can better enlighten us as to what we may expect? What can be a surer guide to us amidst its commotions than the picture of the revolutions that have preceded and prepared the way for it? The present state of knowledge assures us that it will be happy. So he saw the American Revolution and the French Revolution as leading into this great new age. And even though the reign of terror had gotten out of hand, he was still optimistic that this revolution was going to produce great equality, great justice, great freedom, great compassion. He envisioned a time in which everyone would, quote, have the knowledge necessary to conduct himself in the ordinary affairs of life according to the light of his own reason, to preserve his mind free from prejudice, to understand his rights, and to exercise them in accordance with his conscience and his creed. And for Condorcet, this meant freedom from Christianity. He says in one place that if what Europe is enjoying is going to spread to Africa and Asia, they must be free from, quote, the monks who brought only shameful superstition to these people, meaning Jesuits and other monastery groups. So he is a brilliant reflection of this unconstrained vision. People are getting better. The world will get better. Society we can look forward to now. We'll be free from superstition, guided by reason, and we have great things to look forward to. Going from France now, for these remaining few minutes, back to England, to William Godwin. William Godwin, 1756 to 1836. Godwin was a philosopher, a novelist, and perhaps the most radical English voice at the culmination of the Enlightenment century. His most significant work, 3 volumes entitled Political Justice, and you can even see just different language. You can see now titles, justice. The Marquis talked about equality and inequality, which you can see how we are already having the makings of what we now know as right and left, which come from the French Revolution, where those who were on the side of the monarchy sat on the right and those who were on the opposite sat on the left. In Political Justice, he lays out a vision diametrically opposed to what we will see in Edmund Burke. Godwin's belief in the individual's autonomy and perfectibility was so extreme that he called for, quote, the dissolution of political government. So he is an early anarchist. And it's not because he wants anarchy, but because he thinks that we are reaching the point where humans will no longer need government. Now, before we say a bit about Godwin, just a little bit, I need to say something about his family. He was married to the early feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. And their daughter was Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, and she was married to Percy Bysshe Shelley, the famous poet. So this is a family of great literary accomplishment. Wollstonecraft died at 38 years old, 11 days after giving birth to Mary. Now, I know one of the faults you could say of this class, I think it's been an inevitable fault considering just the people in the 18th century who were writing and had access to education and publishing. We've been studying all men, and so coming to the very end of the class, and now I'm going to talk for a few minutes about a woman, Mary Wollstonecraft. She died at 38 after giving birth to Mary. Following her death, Godwin, who had been married to her just for a short time, published an account of his wife's life. Now, he may have thought it was a great act of love to give an honest account of Wollstonecraft's life, but it ended up ruining her reputation, at least for 100 years, and to a degree marred his own reputation, as he revealed that she had had multiple affairs, she had an illegitimate child, she had pretended to be married to a previous man, twice she tried to commit suicide, she only agreed to marry Godwin, they only agreed to marry each other when she was already pregnant, she likely came from something of an abusive home, she was a very troubled woman. She wrote her famous work in 1792, Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Now, that's a play on Vindication of the Rights of Man, which was another book, but now she said the Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She says, we will never have equality in society if, quote, one half of mankind be chained to its bottom by fate. Women needed independence. She decried the inequality in rank and inequality in education. She didn't deny outright the importance of motherhood, but she said for most women, motherhood is fine, but there are some who can rise above it. Quote, still, to avoid misconception, though I consider that women in the common walks of life are called to fulfill the duties of wives and mothers by religion and reason, I cannot help but lamenting that women of a superior caste have not a road open by which they can pursue more extensive plans of usefulness and independence. So she is often considered a proto-feminist or the first feminist. She said for common women, motherhood, to be a wife, that's fine. But those of a, quote, superior caste can find ways and ought to have opportunities for education and to do something more useful. And it's hard not to see some autobiography in that statement. She always felt confined by home life. Quote, how many women thus waste life away, the prey of discontent, who might have practiced as physicians, regulated a farm, managed a shop, stood erect, supported by their own industry, instead of hanging their heads, surcharged with the dew of sensibility that consumes the beauty to which at first gave luster. And again, she's one of those people, and in some ways you can read her, and she's saying women should be educated, and women could be doctors, and women could manage things, and from our vantage point, surely that's right. That does make sense. And yet there's a opposition to traditional realms for women that I hope would give us pause. She argues in the end that women would be, quote, more observant daughters, more affectionate sisters, more faithful wives, more reasonable mothers, in a word, better citizens, if they could have their freedom and enjoy rational fellowship with men. Back to Godwin very quickly. In Political Justice, Godwin distills his project into 5 propositions. Here's what he says. 1, sound reasoning and truth, when adequately communicated, must always be victorious over error. 2, sound reasoning and truth are capable of being so communicated. 3, truth is omnipotent. 4, the vices and moral weakness of man are not invincible. 5, man is perfectible, or in other words, capable of perpetual improvement, end quote. That's his plan. You can communicate truth, and when you do, truth is invincible. It always wins out. Man is perfectible. He is capable of perpetual improvement. If Burke, as we'll see, was the great defender of tradition and institutions, Godwin was the opponent of all those. Most famously, Godwin opposed the institution of marriage. Now, he and Mary Wollstonecraft got married, but neither of them really believed in marriage. She had pretended to be married before because it was needed to be socially acceptable. But Godwin argued truly intelligent beings should be independent of each other. And marriage makes you very dependent upon someone else. And your opinions were going to meld into, quote, a common mold. No, you needed to be independent. He continues, quote, add to this that it is absurd to expect the inclination and wishes of two human beings to coincide through any long period of time. To oblige them to act and to live together is to subject them to some inevitable portion of thwarting, bickering, and unhappiness, end quote. He criticizes what he called the evil of marriage, in which he said, thoughtless, romantic youth see each other for a few times and they make a vow of eternal attachment. He says, quote, what is the consequence of this? In almost every instance, they find themselves deceived. They are reduced to make the best of an irretrievable mistake. Now, on the one hand, surely there's some common sense wisdom there. Make sure people know each other and get good counsel before entering into a lifelong decision. But he is a deep cynic about marriage. You just put people together and they're bound by an irretrievable mistake. Now, it was a different sort of marriage system, not lengthy, often periods of courtship and getting to know one another. It may have been, here's your second cousin and we set you up and you meet each other and you get married. He argued that if I speak of, quote, my wife and hold on to her, I'm, quote, guilty of the most odious selfishness. So he thought there should be open marriages or open relationships. And he said, if we do away with marriage, people won't really be more promiscuous. No, what will happen is they'll just come together for a time and they'll be committed to each other. And then when that runs its course, they'll open it up and they won't be so possessive of one another. It's true freedom, true independence, not to be bound together in this thing called marriage. Quote, certainly no ties ought to be imposed upon either party, preventing them from quitting the attachment whenever their judgment directs them to quit. Overall, Godwin reckons, and this is perhaps one of the worst predictions in history, quote, the abolition of the present system of marriage appears to involve no evils. That was Godwin's prediction. To get rid of marriage as we know it, I can't think of anything bad that will result. Godwin marks a transition into what would later be called Romanticism, understood by one author, quote, as revolt against the finite. That's a pretty good definition for a lot of Romanticism and for Godwin's view on marriage and political philosophy. A revolt against the finite. An unconstrained vision of the possibilities of a nation and the possibilities and perfectibility of the human person.